So originally I did have a sketch for this character, and this would have been many years ago when I first modeled it out, but unfortunately I don't have access to that sketchbook anymore, and what I like to do usually when I create HUDs like this is to sketch from is to work from a sketch so that it's a little bit more flat and cartoony, and I can just scan it in really quick and to path it out in Photoshop to create my shapes like I'm doing here. And the reason why I like to do that rather than taking screenshots and just tracing over them is just that it gives it a little bit more character, even though I have actually done that in the past, just taking a screenshot. But in this particular case, I just find it's a little bit easier to just create from my head rather than relying too much on what I see in world. So what you can see here so far is that I have blocked out the shapes of the kitten head and ears, and then kind of I'm working in some more of the details like the ear floofs. And as I go, I like to turn the line art on and off to see what the final piece will look like. Here I'm roughing out the details of the eyes and creating the general shape of the underlying eyeball, as well as figuring out the overall shape of the iris and what I'd like to do with the overlying color. Now, I actually had to figure out what I wanted to do with this a couple different times, and I'm just roughing out the stripes on the left-hand side, ensuring that they'll be different compared to the ones on the right, even if only marginally so. If the outline and the pupil its own layer on top of that. There's also an additional shadow layer that kind of is a slight gradient going down from the top down, just to give the iris a little bit more depth. Then I move ahead to roughing out some of the stripes. Now, while I could absolutely create just one side and then mirror it over, I chose not to because I do want to preserve some sense of asymmetry overall. It's at this point that I try to figure out where exactly I want my middle to be, and I also start working out the nose and the snout details, which I will ultimately mirror. Then I also, at this point, start working out the reflections for the eye because I'm about to mirror it. So I go for a fairly pale underlying reflection, just to pretend that our ambient light source is rather light. And then I add a specular reflection here, but I'm not too happy with the shape, so eventually I just redo it. I also end up adding a slight specular reflection there to reflect the snout a little bit. And then I duplicate the layer and start mirroring. So I actually have an action defined in Photoshop for this. And basically it just selects the whole layer and then flips it. And I have that tied to a function key. It's at this point that I start adding some of the paler fur details that go around the eye and the snout and the bottom of the face, just to give it a little bit more variation. And in this case I do mirror it eventually, just because it's something that's fairly general and it is generally mirrored as well. And then I also mirror the snout details. And then I add to the bottom of the kitten face and mirror it over. At this point I start working in some shadows for under the chin and underneath the face in general. I also eventually add some shading in between the eyes to improve the bridge of the kitten's nose, just so it matches up a little bit and gives it a little bit more depth. And then I start adding the whisker holes, which in this case are a little bit messy, so I redo them in more of a line fashion, which is usually what they look like on cats and dogs, and then I reposition it a little bit. And then once I'm happy with that, I mirror that, and that's pretty much what I've ended up with. I might change it a little bit, but I'm pretty happy with how that turned out. That concludes my process video. I might tweak things a little later, but hopefully you get the idea of what I tend to do. If you have comments, questions, likes or dislikes, please do leave some feedback in the comments below. If you like my work, please do check it out in World at the Wilds of Organica main store, located in Organica region, and I'll link that below. I can also be reached on both Twitter and Instagram as Akishichiroji, all one word. I also now have a Patreon campaign through which I'll be posting updates, work in progress, as well as some patron exclusive goodies. That's it for now. I will catch you next time. Bye bye.